occasionally we'd have development athletes who could lift more in the weight room than the national team athletes. Development athletes that were like freaks on the bike in the lab with great numbers in their physiology. They weren't necessarily the ones, again, getting selected for the national team or winning races. If we have athletes that are stronger than the people who are winning medals, is me adding another 20 pounds to their squat going to be what makes the difference? Probably not. So, like, is there something I can figure out to do in the weight room that's going to help them?
If you could just continually push one system, so in terms of the gym, it's like force production. And if you continually try and increase your force production, you'll get really good at applying force production, but that will come at the cost of, not being tired at the top of the stairs at some point. Welcome back to Recommended Daily Value. I'm your host, Tyler Woodward, and in today's episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Nicholas Simpson. Nicholas might honestly be one of the smartest guests I've had on the show, and that's saying a lot. And he's definitely the most diverse guest in terms of the range of topics he's educated on within the health, fitness, and nutrition sphere. We dive into everything from movement patterns to supplementation to working out and much more. I think you guys will really enjoy this one, so I'll see you in there. Nicholas Simpson, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
Good, thanks, Tom.
Glad to have you on. How's the weather out in Calgary?
It's pretty cold right now, but it's warming up.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it's been in like minus 20 Celsius for a little bit. Now we're getting into some positive.
I would not consider that as really cold. That's not pretty cold, but that's frigid. But cool. I'm really excited today because we're gonna kind of dive into a little bit of your knowledge base. You're a very interesting fella because you've gone into the Ray Peat sphere. You've gone into a little bit of, I think, movement, or a lot of movement in terms of, I think, GOTA a little bit, but also with the PRI stuff. And I'm very interested at the kind of merger between those two and how, you have envisioned that. But before we get into that, how did you get into this kind of world?
Yeah, so I did my Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology. I had spent a little time as a summer student at an oil company, and that kind of set my mind that I didn't want to work in an office forever. And I loved movement and training. Ultimately decided not to pursue any master's or PhD or anything at that time, but as soon as I graduated, I was hired on at the Canadian Sport Institute, Calgary. And so they deal with a lot of the high performance winter sports and some summer sports in Calgary. And then ended up working about a decade there with our Olympic national team and development team speed skaters. So there's about 2.5 Olympic quads for almost as long now with the varsity swimmers at the university, and then a lot of other individuals and high performance athletes along the way. And now I'm more on the private side. So myself and Carla Robbins run Vital Strength and Physiology. And then as far as the bioenergetic side, I remember there was a strength coach I was following back in the day, Charles Poliquin. And I'd done some of his materials, and I remember him talking about the benefits of fish oil. And I probably overdid that a little bit following his recommendation and started to get these weird side effects from it. Like I would take a tablespoon of fish oil and then maybe an hour later just barely be able to keep my eyes open. My eyes would almost feel like they're vibrating or something.
He was recommending like lots of fish oil too, right?
Yeah. Like I think for certain people for a certain period of time, he would recommend like 45 grams a day or something.
Jesus.
I did nail it down to the fish oil is what was causing that problem. And it was like a reliable thing that came on. I tried different brands, nothing helped. And at the time, everything on the internet was basically saying that fish oil was the bee's knees and everybody should take it. But I came across Ray's article on that, the Great Fish Oil Experiment. And that was sort of the first negative thing I had seen on it. But also just getting exposed to him, was really interested, and then ended up doing this deep dive, like reading all of Ray's articles and then reading every single one of Georgi Dinkov's posts on the forum, reading all Danny's stuff, everything Rob Turner had on his website, Functional Performance Systems, and then just learning how to integrate that stuff with my own nutrition and diet and playing around with it.
So I know you've been sort of on the bodybuilder side, you've done powerlifting. Where do you see yourself now? I know you've done a lot of movement stuff too. I've seen you with, I think, David Gray Rehab. I think you went to his seminar and the Flexible and all those guys.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a story with that where when I was working with the speed skating teams at the Olympic Oval, and I was really fortunate to have this opportunity just to see like athletes from the development teams like rising up to the national development and national teams over the years and being able to follow like the same athletes over a long time. But what I started to notice over that time was that occasionally we'd have development athletes who could lift more in the weight room than the national team athletes, development athletes that were like freaks on the bike in the lab with great numbers in their physiology. They weren't necessarily the ones, again, getting selected for the national team or winning races. And on the national team, the athletes that were winning medals often weren't like the strongest and weren't always the best in the lab either. So there's some kind of differentiating factor. Speed skating is a technical sport, but it's obviously, even with like a lesser engine, so to speak, their efficiency must have been better. They were getting more into the ice. And in high performance sport, you often have a big team around you. Like we would have our sport coaches, the strength coach, myself, the physiologist, dietitian, mental performance, biomechanist sometimes, all of that. And, I essentially just wanted to stay relevant and do what I could for those athletes where, okay, if we have athletes that are stronger than the people who are winning medals, is me adding another 20 pounds for their squat going to be what makes the difference? Probably not. So like, is there something I can figure out to do in the weight room that's going to help them? And the process that we went through to figure that out was just asking the coaches, like, in this athlete, is there anything technically you want them to do on ice that they're not doing? And they might say something like, yes, I want them to do this. I've told them that 100 times and they still don't do it. And they're kind of like at a loss for what they can do. So myself and the physios would just take those athletes. Like we start off in the physio room, put them on the table, be like, well, the coach wants to hit this position on ice. Can that athlete, does their body actually have that range of motion? And sometimes the answer was no, like you literally can't put their leg in that position because they're too tight or something. So sometimes some simple physio treatments, some stretching, rolling was all it took for them to be able to do that. Other times they could get there, but they weren't really strong or powerful or didn't have endurance in those specific positions. So then that's where we'd come more into the weight room and be like, well, if I'm trying to get them stronger at the very end of their speed skating stride, just having them do more squats isn't going to do anything for that position. So is there something I can like recreate in the weight room? It's a little bit easier to control than them trying to do on the ice and make them stronger in that specific way that need to be stronger. And we got really good feedback and results from doing more of that specific training for those particular athletes. For other people, they just need to get stronger and build bigger engines. But that really sparked my interest in the functional movement side of things that I'd ignored a little bit before, because lots of people do have that perspective. Like, there are lots of strength coaches will say, my job as a strength coach is just to make you stronger. And then it's yourself as the athlete and the coach's job to like turn that into something.
So you would view the gap as kind of bridging the gap, but you would view it as kind of bridging the gap between the sport and the weight room, your job.
Yeah. My job is just to like make them perform better with like the tools that I have. and whatever that means. Like if it's squats and deadlifts, it's squats and deadlifts. If it's plyometrics, if it's some kind of dry land sprinting or conditioning, or if it's like all of those things plus a specific exercise to bridge the gap somewhere.
Could you give an example of an exercise that you might have used to transfer that over to speed skating? Or like strengthening a certain range, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, one example that comes to mind was, and he's given me permission to share this before, but Gil Junio was one of our best sprint speed skaters. And one thing we noticed with him was when he was doing his starts on ice, he had much more rotation to one side of his body. And so his like arm swing would seem kind of limited on one side, and then he'd have a nice full rotation and arm swing to the other side. And then, so he did some treatment around that, but also in the weight room, literally just like set him up in front of a cable stack, similar to how you would do like a pec fly. But we put him in a position that was a little bit more similar to his skating start, and then had him like rotate into the side that he was limited to. So just a basic mobility drill in a very specific position for him. And then he did that regularly. And then at the Olympic trials, he won the Canadian Championships that year, and like 70 PB at a start with more even rotation.
That's awesome.
And then we would also do things, like most movements in the weight room tend to be up and down, but for speed skating especially, there's a lot of lateral push, like hip abduction. And so I've done both like band and cable resisted abductions, where we're like getting in a speed skating position and then driving to the side. And we did some fun pendulum stuff with that too, like throwing a dumbbell or a kettlebell across the body, sort of a loaded plyo skater.
Interesting. And how has that altered your perspective on what you're doing in the gym?
Well, it's just whenever someone comes up to us with an issue now, I feel comfortable getting a lot more creative with it for problem solving what that issue is. And get a lot of the typical approaches are just get stronger and do some stretching. And sometimes those help, but they don't necessarily translate to the movement. And I think there's some research on that as well, where, a common thing that might happen in running is when someone's standing at mid stance, their weight's right over one leg, you'll see a hip drop, where like the opposite pelvis kind of drops towards the ground. And they would say that's typically associated with a weak glute med. So if this is like the glutes on the outside of the leg, it should be contracting there in order to lift this side of the pelvis up and prevent it from kind of sagging down. So if you just strengthen that muscle, say someone does clamshells or like side leg lifts, they can demonstrate that the muscle gets stronger from that. But then when they watch those people running again, a lot of them do exactly the same thing. And so you have to find like, okay, they have the strength to do it now, but what's a coordination drill that can get them doing it while they're running?
Is it a coordination drill or a coordination issue a lot of the time, or a lack of mobility?
It can be either. Like I've seen all sorts of mix. So I've seen some people come in and we're working on something with the running gait, and within a single session, I can just show them like the drill, and this is what I want you to do, and they'll connect with it and be able to do it right away. And it still might be a bit more conscious. It's not necessarily an unconscious behavior yet, but they can do what I want. They have the strength to do it. Other times, the drill's even a no-go because they like literally can't get into the position that I want because something's too tight or too weak or some combination. And then it's going to be like multiple weeks to strengthen that or improve the range in order for them to coordinate themselves in the right way.
Yeah. How has this altered your own view for your training, though? How do you train differently knowing all this knowledge? Because you were just kind of a meathead powerlifter, correct?
Yeah. I mean,
As am I. No,
yeah,
no shame there.
yeah, absolutely. Love being a meathead.
Yes, sir.
I competed in weightlifting for about 5 years. When I competed, I wasn't very good technically, but as I kind of retired from that, did powerlifting for another 5 or 6 years. And I think it's a transition a lot of lifters make, but at some point you do, like I was very stiff and immobile when I was powerlifting. And at some point you want to be and feel healthier. And, I have a daughter that's almost 9 months old now, and I want to be able to, run around and play with her and not feel like I'm dying or struggling to get to the ground. And I just enjoy doing a variety of things. So I recognize that if I specialize in any one thing too much, that's going to start to limit something else. And I think that falls into what you're asking about posture, but like, our muscles will adapt to become more efficient at whatever range that we're training in. So if we're constantly like only really exposing them to one kind of stress, things might get short and tight in a way that specializes you for that activity. That's like probably makes you better at it, but it's going to start to hurt your ability to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to be able to do other things now.
Yeah, I understand that for sure.
Yeah.
One thing that I've found has helped in terms of my mobility is taking, muscles through their full range of motion, and like in terms of both the agonist and the antagonist, doing, like a deep squat versus like a lying hamstring curl. That seems to help. But I think what you're more so referring to is your body. If you just continually push one system, so in terms of the gym, it's like force production. And if you continually try and increase your force production, you'll get really good at applying force production, but that will come at the cost of, not being tired at the top of the stairs at some point.
I mean, yes and no. Like, being with posture, I think it's almost like the teeter-totter, where like if you constantly just apply load and stress to like one side of that teeter-totter, you're going to get imbalanced in one way. And I think a mistake some people make is like, say your stress is like every time you go to the gym and you bench press, and then the rest of the day you're sitting in front of a computer. So really things on the front side are loaded and tend to shorten that position. But the mistake is that someone thinks they can just like think about holding themselves in a good posture, and that is going to fix the problem. And that's kind of like, if you have this big load pushing down one side of the teeter, and then you're trying to push right off the like fulcrum of that to lift that big load back to the middle. But really what you need to do is like apply load to the other side of that. Like you were saying, a full range of motion at like agonist and antagonist. And that's what's going to bring you back into balance over the middle. As far as like force production capabilities, I don't necessarily see that as like something that in itself is going to make someone like tired or out of gas or non-athletic. It's still more so the lack of other things. Like, so if you do a lot of strength training, but you also keep up with some aerobic work, you can maintain a relationship in the body that's like that. It doesn't gas you. And you see lots of bodybuilders who do the full splits on stage. They just make sure that they're balancing out whatever work they're doing with enough flexibility training, like mobile heavyweight weightlifters and heavyweight athletes in other sports. As long as it's not always like, it's not the application of force so much as the problem, it's the lack of diversity where that causes people to run into issues.
Okay. You mentioned that you stopped lifting for 2 years. Was it related to the movement school of thought trying to increase your movement variability?
Yeah. So there are a few things that overlapped there, but towards the end of that powerlifting phase, I was kind of giving myself one shot to push it. But I also had just gotten engaged. I felt a little guilty because I would work long days and then I would head to the gym and spend like 3 hours doing a powerlifting program and get home at like 8 p.m. And meanwhile, my wife would have gotten home from work and just been like sitting there with the dogs, having dinner by herself. So there's some guilt around that. And then at the same time, like I've had some back issues in the past, and then pushing it too hard that time flared things up. Had a little pec injury. And at that point, I was like, it's not worth it anymore. Like, I don't want to keep pushing in this direction. And so I took a break. I wanted to learn how to run and move better. And I was looking at, some of the inspirations at that time were functional patterns, go to WEC method, and various other like movers. But one of the things FP would nail home is just that they believed that if you're doing other things, it was going to like slow down your progress for learning how to move better. And at least tried that out. And I have seen it in clients too, but if they are stiff individuals and they've already lost a significant amount of range of motion, it's going to be really hard, not impossible, but just difficult to gain range when they're doing things through a limited range and like continuing to stiffen themselves up. So I do think taking a break helped me to gain that range a lot quicker than if I had kept going with it.
Were you attempting to achieve a neutral pelvis, or what was the range you were looking to get back?
Some of it was overhead range. So like, it's pretty common, like people might get stuck somewhere around here before their back really starts to extend and compensate it. So I just wanted to, like, everything was super stiff in the lats and chest and everything. Yeah, exactly. And so trying to open up to a nice full overhead range without my posture and my spine changing. My hips were super tight. So when I was powerlifting and weightlifting, I would often get some pinching in my left hip, like a FAI, femoral impingement type symptoms. That was one thing that would hold me back. And I also noticed that whenever my hips got tight, my low back would start rounding more in my squats and deadlifts and pulls, and it would be hard to get to a good position. And that would irritate my back. So I had a lot of work to do to like loosen up the thighs and the hips, and like reliably lifting heavy would tighten them up at that time. And I remember when I was pushing some of those blocks hard, I would have to get treatment like twice a week just to maintain like good positions. And I was lucky to know some good therapists, but not really a sustainable way. And now the way I train heavy, I just have a better feel for how my body like stiffens and like how much of a break I need between heavy sessions and what kind of work I need to do to avoid that.
Was it tough transitioning off of lifting, not doing anything too intense?
Not really. It was just it was what I wanted at that time. Like I felt like I had pushed those things a lot, like achieved pretty good numbers in a lot of lifts for my size, and then I was worried that if I did push them again, it was gonna hurt my body. But eventually, as I started to move better, and the things I learned about movement, human movement in general, came back to lifting. Because in lifting, where I was told that like straight up and down is ideal, like you don't really want your knees caving in. Sometimes they'll exaggerate the opposite, like knees out, but you see all this rotation in every sport. And initially, when I started to see that in movement, I was like, wow, nothing we normally do in the weight room really trains any of those rotational qualities that you see in running or skating or any other sport or activity, which led to some creative exercise. But then when I actually started to pay more attention to lifting again in the best lifters, you do see those things. You do see like knees moving in and out, and like anterior tilts and the pronation, supination, the feet. All the rotations are there. We're just normally told that we're bad and we need to avoid them. And that was one thing that got me excited about lifting again. It's like, well, I've always tried not to allow any of this movement. How would my body feel if I actually like allowed that or even exaggerated it to what you see in some of these like top weightlifters? And would I be able to push more while hurting myself less?
How has that worked out?
Pretty good so far. There's still a learning curve, and injuries, like technique is only one component of injury, and the other is still load management. Like you get guys who have horrible looking technique on something, but they've like adapted to that stress in a smart, progressive way, and their body is used to it and won't break down. You could have someone with really nice looking technique, but if you put too much weight on the bar for what their body's like currently prepared for, you can break something or injure something. And so I did have a few setbacks along the way. And one of the things I learned was that a lot of the programs I've followed in the past, and I've like whether it was something I found or a coach that I was working with, they had a higher volume or higher frequency of lifting than, at least at this stage in my life, my body was ready for. So it's pretty common for weightlifting to squat anywhere from like 3 to 12 times a week.
3, you mean sets, right?
No, like times per week.
Like 12 sessions a week?
Yeah, so I mean, some lifters might train weightlifters might train twice a day during the week and then like once a day on the weekends.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that they're like going crazy on like every one of those sessions. It might be like in the 70% range, but there's some people who push that and think squatting often is the ticket. And for some people, it might be. But for myself, when I tried that, usually something broke down. And when I've had a few setbacks with my back in the last few years, I ended up consulting with Brian Carroll, who's a power lifter who I think in like a multiply gear, he squatted 1,200 pounds. But he crushed his lower back, I think through a combination of lifting and then one injury when he was doing like an obstacle course from the police or something like that. But he ended up working with Stu McGill, who does a lot of like back research and rehab, and was able to recover himself from that injury and get back to the top level. But either way, one thing Brian imposed upon me was after getting a solid period of rest from my back, he only had me lifting like with heavy compressive loads on my spine once a week. So he found that was an optimal frequency for him, where he'd squat on deadlift on the same day. It would give his body a whole week to recover from it, and then he could hit it hard again. And still like frequent enough to make progress, but with no setbacks. And then I did that for about a year with really good success. And then as of this year, I'm pushing it a little bit to every 5 days. So it ends up being about like one extra session in a 2-week period. It's almost 30% more volume but it still seems like a pretty good interval for me. It's a little weird having your lifting days end up on a different day of the week every week. They've been able to manage it. So
yeah. It's super funny because it's the 7-day calendar is so irrelevant, but it's so integrated into our whole lifestyle that I've done like 7-day lifting splits. And it's so awkward. It's like, oh, I guess it's Tuesday, but that means my lift is different than it was last Tuesday and the next Tuesday.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've done that. And for some athletes too, where we'll do like rolling programs where it's like, you don't stress if you can't do this on a certain day. It's just like, do these days in this order when you have the chance to.
Okay. So I feel like in that movement kind of sphere, it's not that they view weightlifting as bad, but they think that you're basically going to end up compensating if you continually weightlift, if you continue to try to maximize force production, which I guess at the extreme you're going to. I think you would agree there. But it seems like you, and then I guess this is my question as well, have you been able to maintain the posture gains that you corrected? So, and for the audience, basically what you did is you try to get back to a more neutral posture where you could get maybe 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. What is it? 60 degrees of internal rotation at the hips and somewhere around there. I forget what the PRI standards are or whatever standards you were using, but basically to allow you to move better without compensation. Have you been able to maintain those posture gains, we can call them? And do you think that lifting is always going to come at the cost of that?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's always going to come at the cost of that. And I think like with a lot of things, it's hard to achieve something the first time, but it's like once you have that quality, it's much easier to maintain it. So I think like if you follow Juji Mufu, he talks about like doing the splits and how much work that took the first time. And the guy, range of strength, he'll talk about how for most people starting from scratch, it might take like 3 years of dedicated work to get the full splits. But once you have it, it's relatively like, it just takes a minimum of maintenance. So it did take me quite a while and a lot of work to get that 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. But I barely have to do anything to maintain that. I did notice in the last 6 months, I haven't done a lot of overhead stuff. All of a sudden, I was like, went to demo something and I was like, oh, this feels really stiff because I haven't used that range in a long time. But it literally took like 3 little sessions where I did some like hanging and breathing and some mobility drills, and then it was back to normal.
That's cool.
So yeah, I think it just it requires like a little bit of input once you have it already, and they don't have to interfere with each other. And then as far as the rotations too, I think because like Goda talks about how they think lifting is backwards, like relative to running. Like in running, there's a sequence of rotations that happens in the like foot and leg, and they'll say that what happens in running is opposite to what you see in lifting. And therefore, if you like train lifting a lot, you build faulty movement patterns and it ends up messing up your running. But I disagree with that in that I think the rotations are sequenced in essentially exactly the same order in like running, jumping, and lifting. And this kind of flow of out to in and then back out. So I don't think they interfere. And I think if you're knowledgeable about that and you allow it to happen naturally in lifting and you're not trying to fight it, then they probably build very similar qualities.
And I want to give credence to that argument I said before a little bit, because it's kind of what you did, right? If you had tried to continue to lift while trying to take your posture back and get to a more neutral position, probably would have been really, really hard. But because you kind of took that as your focus. So it might be hard to correct your posture while you're also trying to improve a bunch of other qualities. But if you kind of prioritize one.
Yeah. I mean, like trying to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Like I'm going to, cut calories and lift heavy. Like it is easier when you just choose like one thing to prioritize and maintain the rest. I do have clients sometimes where, they're just guys that love heavy lifting. They also recognize that they're like stiff and that might be contributing to some problems. But it's very rare that someone actually wants to stop lifting for a time. And in that case, you just have to know that it's going to take longer. And also try to push those, like it's going to be hard to do through training. So if you can like accelerate this with some physio, massage, or chiro, and like soft tissue work, that'll go a long way too.
What are your kind of staples in terms of trying to maintain your posture now? Is there any way you're lifting differently? And then what do you think about in the PRI world, which I'm not very well versed in, but I know a little bit about it. They kind of think that your compensations are your superpowers. So how stiff that power lifter is actually allowing him to produce as much force as possible. Do you kind of differ there as well?
Yeah, I've heard that from a few people. That's something like Brian mentioned in one of his books too, where he said, you don't want super mobile hamstrings for a power lifter. You want like it to be a struggle to reach your hands to the bar. And then like that stiffness is what's going to contribute to like you pulling 800 pounds or something. I think there's some truth to that. But there's, also a lot of people like, again, the weightlifters who have like great movement in their hips and lower legs, and Dmitry Klokov, crazy flexibility and still lifting an insane amount of weight. So I don't really think for the average person, they should like deliberately try to let themselves get stiff in order to lift more. Another example of that is with feet, and like we do a lot of stuff with feet just because of how everything is connected up the chain. So like if you pay attention when someone kind of pronates their feet and the pressure rolls to the inside, their shins and their thighs and their knees are all going to roll in at the same time. And the same thing will happen when their feet kind of supinate and roll to the outside. Everything up the chain rolls to the outside as well. And so we tend to ignore what the feet are doing. But say someone had like very valgus knees that you were trying to address for some very knock knee position. Common thing is to say that person has weak glutes, like let's put a mini band around the knees, teach their glute to contract to pull their knees out. And that's not to say that it's not going to be a benefit, but if you have like a hip that's trying to pull your knee to the outside, but then at the bottom end of that, you have this foot that's stuck on the inside edge, those two things are going to be fighting each other, and this is not going to let the knee move to the outside. And so for most people, having a foot that readily changes shape and moves in between like pronation and supination is going to give them the best function. But there's a few examples of like elite athletes, like Usain Bolt's one. I think there's photos of LeBron's feet, and they look like super flat, like toes are pinched together, and they're obviously performing at a very high level. And so that's like there can be a lot of advantage for power production when you're pushing off the inside edge of your foot and towards the big toe. And that's usually like they say that when your foot pronates, the bones kind of spread apart that lets your foot adapt to the ground, but it's kind of like it's usually softer and squishier in that position. And then as you normally toe off, your foot supinates, kind of pulls tight together, and that creates like a rigid lever for you to put force into the ground. But you have these elite athletes where they're toeing off kind of the opposite way, so off the big toe on the inside, position that would normally be looser, but their tissue's starting to really like stiffen up as a result of just training that. And over time, you have a foot that looks flat, but it's like solid as a rock, is like normal person's supinated foot. That would be one case where they've like, specialized and stiffened in a way that really facilitates like one activity. And that's probably like a non-negotiable if you want to perform at that level.
Yeah. What I'm kind of gathering from your perspective, though, is that it might not be a bad thing for them to have a little bit more variability there. Yeah. As long as they're able to reach that extreme and have that stiffness, and that might be a cost of being LeBron James, the best in the world, but it's also going to make it much more injury prone, right? Because if you think about, as you're saying before, he's teetering on the edge, and that inside edge might just collapse at some point, and he's going to fall.
Yeah. And I have like a ultra distance runner who logs tons of miles running and has gotten a very stiff body as a result of that. It's probably a passive stiffness that allows him to be very efficient and economical running. But if he lets it get too far, he gets to the point where, like, when he wants to just ride his bike casually, he has trouble like lifting his leg up to get on the bike. He's worried that if his shoes come untied in the middle of the race, he actually won't be able to like bend over and tie them up because he's that stiff. And then the hip starts to hurt a little bit. So it's like, we'll scale in the mobility until you can do those things and like pain-free. It doesn't mean we need to turn him into a gymnast, which might have like a detrimental effect on his running, but some kind of like middle ground.
What would be your interventions for that middle ground? So say me, don't really do too much mobility work outside of the gym or the ultra runner. I've been integrating a lot more sprints and plyos, which I think are beneficial. But even for you, what's your mobility routine, I guess, sort of now? What kind of exercises are you focusing on?
Well, it can be super simple. Like while I acknowledge that like static stretching can be effective in a lot of cases, like I don't really enjoy doing it. So I try to find like exercises and movement where I'm just going through bigger ranges of motion. So for the like shoulder example, I love doing like single arm dumbbell or kettlebell swings, where it's essentially a ballistic stretch, but you're just swinging that weight up. And then as it gets overhead, it's trying to like, if you're not conscious about your core, it'll knock you into a really extended position. But if you maintain that core, like force yourself to get straight, it provides a very good mobility stimulus. For my hips, I find when I squat heavy, my adductors get very tight. And then I'll start to feel them like pulling on the attachments. And the tighter they get, the more narrow my squat stance gets. And then like as they get tighter, my low back will start rounding. So just in order to keep my adductors loose, I basically find one of those like good girl machines at the gym for like seated adduction. And I'll set it to the maximum range of motion. And then I'll just use like a warm up where I'm going through like the long half of the range of motion, cranking out like 30 reps at longer muscle lengths. And then I might sit in the stretch for like 30 seconds at the end. But since I've started doing that, I've not had like a single groin issue, and my hips feel buttery squatting.
We love to hear it. So you take kind of a head-on approach of just taking that muscle through its range of motion and trying to maintain that.
Yeah, generally like muscles can grow in one of two ways. They can get thicker or they can get longer. And generally, if you train at long muscle lengths, that will encourage some of the growth for the muscle to actually lengthen.
Mm-hmm. What about, let's take me, for example, if I try and do this overhead kettlebell swing, I'm almost guaranteed to get some compensation in terms of rib flare, maybe lower back arch. How do you, and I think that's kind of what a lot of the PRI people, and I keep throwing that out there because that's what I'm familiar with. I don't know how much you align with them, but they kind of seem to take the opposite approach where you need to be maybe do some breathing exercises, clear up that rib cage, open up the diaphragm to expand your zone of acquisition, and just throwing some fancy terms out there, and try and open up that mobility so then you can regain it in those exercises. Where do you differ there?
I just do both. Like I do both right off the bat. So I love like some of the hanging breathing exercises where someone's hanging from the chin-up bar. They might have their feet supported and they're trying to get more rounded back posture and trying to breathe into their back. But I might just superset that with some swings. So you have a nice kind of passive breathing drill, and then you have an active drill where you're learning to like control your body in movement.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. And then, okay, so for the average person, that's kind of what your approach would be, trying to do some mobility. Maybe it's just a little bit at the beginning and then tying that in with taking the muscle through its full range of motion.
Yeah. And, most people that we see, they have like more than one priority. But if I spent an hour like doing breathing drills with someone, I'm letting like 5 other qualities slide. So it's like, what balance can I find where we get some of that, but we're also doing work to build some muscle or build the physiology.
You mentioned before kind of mixing up exercise variability in terms of movement variability. And that you basically just don't want to only be powerlifting if, that's not if you're not trying to be, Brian Shaw, like step on the stage, to be your best ever at powerlifting, having some different types in there. Is it just kind of, hitting the other extreme? So if you're doing a lot of sprinting, do some more aerobic intensive work. Or if you're doing a lot of lifting, same thing. Or if you're doing, your ultra marathons, try and do some mobility work or some lower intensity lifting, things like that.
Yeah. It's a bit of like a mix of those things. And definitely these days, my time is a lot more limited than it used to be for training. So, I don't, the glory days of like spending 3 or 4 hours in the gym and just like fucking around are gone. But I have a running coach, and I typically run 6 days a week. So I'll get those out of the way like first thing in the morning. And it varies a little bit, but it kind of follows a roughly what you call a polarized model, where I spend about like 80% of the time doing easy aerobic work. So like very low intensity, very slow running, not building a lot of lactic, just kind of like get the cardio going. The other 20% might be some intensity and some higher intervals. In the gym, I just essentially picked a couple lifts that I want to push. So right now I'm pushing my front squat and bench press, and I'll spend the most amount of time, like I'll probably spend an hour just like warming up, building up to a heavy single, and then doing some volume on those lifts. And then any other time I have would be those things to like balance out. So if I find my groin's getting tight, I'll do more good girl. If I'll follow up the bench with lots of back work, and then throw on a bit of overhead mobility. Try to just be pretty fluid, and so I don't have like a big list of things I need to accomplish every time. I'm just kind of, what do I have time for today? What am I going to have fun doing today? And that like motivates me to train. And then if I notice something is tight in there, like I'll throw in some mobility when I have the chance. I noticed my hamstrings were getting a little tight recently, so when I have like 30-minute break sometimes between sessions, I'll pop myself into a stretch with the monkey feet, basically like upside down splits.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to try the monkey feet. I think that would feel so good on my back, just fully decompressing like that.
Yeah, it's nice.
I did one of those things, the inverted tables once, and it's one of the ones where you like flip it back and do it yourself. and my whole spine just cracked. I was like, oh my God, I needed that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've had that before too. Although I have both the an inversion table and the gravity boots where you can like hang off a chin-up bar. But one thing I found is that when my back is feeling good, I can do like a full 180, like fully inverted, either on the table or hanging, and it feels good, and it just provides a nice distraction. But if my back's cranky, it doesn't like that much stress, and there's some research around that where people or their animal models with back issues tend to do better and get a better decompressive effect with just like a very mild decline. So like a 30% decline rather than like fully upside down.
Interesting.
So that's what I shifted to, although I haven't really done any inversion in the last 6 months. It just hasn't felt necessary.
You mentioned lactic training there and kind of trying to stay out of the lactic threshold. So just, producing too much lactic acid, or we're always going to produce a little bit, but trying to refrain from the area where you're producing a lot of lactic acid. I heard you mention on a podcast that you thought lactic training was the most stressful, which I've been doing a little bit of lactic training in terms of trying to increase glycogen stores is like the theory behind it, I believe. But I've found recently, it used to not stress me so much. I found recently it's been very stressful, even though it sounds theoretically like the least stressful. It's very short rest periods. You're not doing that much volume because it's like what I'm doing right now is like 5 sets of 20 seconds. So you have to use a weight that's like 2/3 what you would normally do. And you're done in like 30 minutes. How do you view that? And how do you pair that with kind of the repeat philosophy? Because he's very against producing lactate.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's always a bad thing, but like you have at the endurance side of things, at one end you have like a very low energy demand on your tissues, and you might have like no rest, but it's just like an energy demand that you could supply really easily. At the other end, like the extreme power end, you may have a massive energy demand on your tissues, but it's like short and done with. And then if you're paying attention to that system, you have tons of rest to recover from it. So it's overall like either of those ends of the spectrum are lower stress on the body. And then in the middle, you have this very high energy demand with very low rest. And that's like, so I guess it just puts you in the red, like sooner and deeper, and you spend more time there than either of the extremes. And there are some athletic events that, or a lot of athletic events that take place in that zone. But one of the things with training is so one of the adaptations from training with lactate is that your muscles will produce more of the lactate dehydrogenase enzyme that helps you clear it relatively quickly. But those adaptations are very short-lived. So I think if you stop doing that type of work, it may only take like 2 weeks until those enzymes drop back to a more normal level. So there's not a huge advantage to training that quality year round. And again, the issue with the stress is that because those workouts are so taxing, like it may take me quite a few days to recover from like a hard lactic session, where if I tried to follow that up with a speed workout or like a high power workout of some kind, I'm probably going to have a lower output because I'm still recovering from that lactate. And so it's like the more often you train in the middle, the stuff that should be like hard and powerful is like lower relative to where it should be, just because your recovery is not as good. And that's a common problem in endurance athletes where they do the slow stuff too hard, and it like pushes the easy stuff into the middle intensities because you want to feel like you're working hard. but then they don't recover well enough so that the stuff that should be hard moves into the middle too. And then it ends up being like a very middle dominant program.
When you're doing your training, you said about 80%. What was the term you used? The
polarized training.
Polarized. So what would that 80% look like?
So that's just very slow, easy stuff. Like for myself, anywhere from like 30-minute to an hour and a half right now of just like basically running as slow as I can. And I'll almost always, I do most of my running now with nasal breathing. That can be a bit of a good metric where if like you can't do it breathing through your nose, then it's probably too hard for that kind of stuff.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
How important do you think it is to be nasal breathing for that?
Well, I don't think it's super important. There are people that have success either way. One of the things that piqued my interest in it was that I think I have a bit of mild sleep apnea. And so I had heard that if you do your easy aerobic with nasal breathing, then that will like improve your nasal breathing during your sleep. And I did notice when I started to try to do even my easy stuff with nasal breathing, it felt like I couldn't get enough air that way. And then I would like start to like gasp and just want to open my mouth. And then after doing it consistently, it's not an issue in the cardio at all anymore. It just feels perfectly capable of doing like slow and medium intensity stuff through the nose. And I think that's probably had a good effect on the sleep too. Ray Pete talks about the oxygen dissociation curve and how when you breathe through your nose, you'll end up retaining more carbon dioxide. And then the carbon dioxide allows oxygen to offload more easily from the red blood cells into your tissues. So even though you're probably getting a lower volume of air in and out with nasal breathing, a lower volume of oxygen, it's compensated for by the fact that the oxygen can more easily get into your tissues from the nasal breathing. And there is, I forget his name right now, but there's a guy in Alberta who has like a crazy ultra distance performance, and he credits the nasal breathing to a lot of his success. And he found, I think he read, was it James Nestor, the like Breathe book, that learned about Buteyko breathing, and then said he read Buteyko's like original PhD dissertation in Russian or something.
That's sick.
Him that it was the way to go. And I think there were some stories in there, people like curing their asthma just by learning to breathe through their nose.
Yeah, it is nuts. I remember reading, I don't know if you've read Patrick McCown's book, The Oxygen Advantage. It's similar.
I think I have it, but I haven't made it through it yet.
It's a good book, but similar thought process. And one of the tests he uses to basically diagnose breathing problems is walking while this is used to diagnose your carbon dioxide tolerance, just walking with a breath hold. And you should be able to hold your breath for about 30 seconds. So I had just moved to Colorado, and that's from Jersey. So I was at 0, and now I'm at like 5,000 feet. And I remember I was getting to like 20 seconds. I'd be like walking upstairs, like on my way to work, be like turning red, dying. It's like, why can't I do this?
Yeah. It takes a little while for that adaptation.
Yeah. I found mouth taping at night, though. I think everyone should do it at some point in their life. It seems, I don't necessarily think you need to do it your whole life, but it seemed to have pretty profound effects on my breathing overnight and sleep quality as well.
Yeah. I was curious about that. I had some friends that were doing it. One of the things that held me back from trying it for a long time was just the beard. I was worried that I was going to be ripping hairs off. And then they got me with an ad where there's a beard guy pulling the tape off in the morning. So I think it was just in the last fall that I finally tried some, and it did make a big difference in my sleep. The other thing that helped me there was I found my nose would get quite dry just with our air here, like breathing through the night. And someone recommended that I try vitamin E, a bit of vitamin E in the nose. And I found that was like perfect consistency where it doesn't run. It just keeps things moisturized well. Where those two things together made a big difference.
That's really interesting. In the nose, you said?
Yeah.
Huh. All right. Would not have thought that. So what kind of supplements, if any, do you like to take for your workouts these days?
So there's I don't take them like for the workouts per se, but there were a few things I was trying to improve this year. Sleep in general. I was having some cramping after my endurance stuff that I was trying to figure out. I had some interesting blood work a few years ago where I got just an opportunity to participate in a study where they're looking at trying to find markers related to long COVID. So they just wanted people who had COVID. There was no other criteria, but they measured like 300 things in your blood, metabolomics study, and then you had the opportunity to repeat that test 6 months later. So there are a couple things from that I was trying to figure out and work out. And then that led to doing some stuff around blood flow that I was trying to. But I'll start with the cramping. I don't think it's always related to electrolytes, but it's not a bad place to start. I was getting this pretty bad cramping after my runs, and I'm thinking I'm getting enough sodium, getting enough magnesium, probably getting enough calcium. I typically drink like about 8 liters of raw milk a week. So the only other two electrolytes left there were potassium and phosphorus. And the phosphorus or phosphate I thought was an interesting one. So typically Ray has talked about that in more of a negative light, like the importance of keeping a certain calcium to phosphorus ratio and keeping phosphate on the lower end. And I'd actually had that measured in my blood twice. My phosphate tended to be at like the very low end of the normal range. But there was an article I'd come across a few years ago where they talked about potential benefits of phosphorus in dieting. So I started looking into that again. And I think definitely there can be a case for a lot of individuals not getting enough phosphorus. It seems that when you don't get enough, you're more likely to store the calories you're eating as fat versus when you have the phosphorus available to turn that caloric energy into ATP more readily. And so when people get more phosphorus, it seems to reduce their appetite. They have an easier time making energy in general. And when I got a hold of some, I did find those things like appetite was down. I felt more full on less calories, and it did seem to help with the cramping I was having, and also seemed like my blood sugar was more steady between meals. And I've typically tended towards like reactive hypoglycemia, or where like it's fairly easy for my blood sugar to drop if I don't eat the right things. And I've just learned over the years to avoid certain things that I know are likely to do that. But this has seemed to make a big difference in that regard.
Were you supplementing with the phosphorus, or you just added some meat or something?
Supplementing. And again, like on paper, I was probably getting a good amount of phosphorus from like the amount of meat and milk that I have on a regular basis. But I just added more as a potassium phosphate supplement. And it made a big difference. And I've had some clients that have tried the same thing and reported similar things.
That's really interesting. I would not have thought that. Yeah, right. I would have thought you were going full peating and not getting any meat. So that's interesting that you said you should have been getting enough phosphorus, at least on paper, and you needed that extra bonus.
Yeah. And I don't know why mine tended to be on the low end. It's probably been that way for a while. And it can always, like, if someone's thinking about it, they could always, check their phosphorus, parathyroid hormone, vitamin D to see if they might need it or not. But I know vitamin B3, like niacin, nicotinamide, tend to be phosphate binders and reduce phosphate. So it's possible some like periods where I played around with higher doses of that might have dropped it for a period, but either way, I seem to benefit from more there.
Why do you think it was the phosphate, not the potassium, though? Just because you had low blood levels of the phosphorus, I guess that would make sense.
Yeah, and actually, around the same time, I had a blood test where my potassium was like just barely above the normal range, which doesn't necessarily mean my intake was adequate, but I got a potassium phosphate supplement, so it was getting both, and it's possible that there was a benefit from both. And for other reasons, I got my potassium intake as well. So I have a potassium citrate supplement where I'll usually just add that to some orange juice and try to make sure I get at least like between food and supplements 7 grams of potassium a day.
Do you think your intake is so high because of your activity level, or you just think you just do better with that much potassium?
I seem to seems like I have pretty high demand for a lot of minerals. Like, again, on paper, I thought I eat a lot of meat. Like, I should be getting enough zinc. There was like a little bit of zinc in some supplements I was taking, but I have one of those activity tracker, like a Garmin watch for running, but I wear it during sleep so I can get to the heart rate variability measure, and just been watching that. And when it tracks my sleep, for a while, it was telling me that I was getting no REM sleep. And then I added more zinc at some point on top of what was already probably a high intake, and almost immediately like started having and remembering dreams, and the watch is reporting that I was getting more REM sleep. With magnesium, like I find I probably need like close to 1 gram a day.
Jesus.
Is like a good amount for me that keeps my bowels regular, and like seems to doesn't upset my stomach, whereas like less than 1/3 of that would upset my wife's.
Yeah.
The potassium too was interesting. In that blood work I had, one of the things I was trying to trouble solve is that it measured all the amino acids in your blood. My lysine levels were quite high, at a level like typically someone would have some kind of genetic impairment in the lysine metabolism for their lysine to be that high. And usually you would notice those problems like as a youth if you did have the genetic issue. But so as I started reading about lysine metabolism, potassium came up as something critical to like protein metabolism in general. And there's some interesting research around potassium, like preventing some of the catabolic effects of stress hormones, as well as just processing protein and being necessary for protein synthesis in general. And I did notice that since adding the potassium and phosphate and zinc, I had an easier time putting on muscle and just seemed to like respond to training better.
You can really tell you have a very rigorous scientific approach, because not only did I just asked you what supplements you're taking, and which I loved your answer, but it was like, all right, well, I'm trying to solve these issues, and these are the things that I think might be the culprits for, or a lack of these things could be the culprits for causing it, which is the approach I think everyone should take for supplements, but it's most commonly just like, the B plus C on the shelf.
Yeah. Well, and, I've certainly done that in the past, but like more and more I've learned to be more selective about what I'm taking and not just like trying to be high everything, which sometimes will have unintended consequences, but like having a reason for everything that you're doing. And also just with getting a baby in the house, the wife's on maternity leave, trying to be a little bit more economical with the things I play around with.
Makes sense.
The other thing that was interesting with the lysine was there, and there seems to be, so lysine, arginine, and what is it? It's proline. There's 3 amino acids that are cationic, meaning they have a positive charge on them. So lysine and arginine are 2 of them. And so they use the same transporter, the cationic amino acid transporter, to get into cells. And they can compete with each other for entry. And in animal research, sometimes they'll talk about like antagonism between lysine and arginine. People also talk about that in relationship to like cold sores and how lysine is a popular treatment. And it's supposedly because that herpes virus like feeds on arginine. And so when you up your lysine, it will help suppress the virus. And one thing that came out of that is that the amount of nitric oxide your blood vessels produce is somewhat proportional to the arginine you have circulating around. And again, Ray normally talks about nitric oxide as being a negative thing. I think there's quite a bit of evidence that it has a lot of benefits and that we need that ability to vasodilate with nitric oxide in order to sustain like energy production in our tissues under certain conditions. And there's also evidence that if you try to starve yourself of arginine, it's some people have played around with to drop nitric oxide. The enzyme that produces nitric oxide just starts producing more free radicals that'll produce peroxynitride and superoxide. And I think that ends up being more damaging than any effect the nitric oxide itself would have. And digressing a little bit though, but if you looked at my arginine levels on that blood test, they were fine. They didn't have a deficiency of arginine. But in some papers, they'll calculate something called the arginine bioavailability ratio, where they'll divide your arginine by your lysine, plus I think it's ornithine is the other cationic amino acid. And when you use that metric, my arginine availability, because my lysine was so high, it was like equivalent to someone who had severe COVID. And that's relevant in COVID. Again, this is another side story, but arginine also has some really important roles for the immune system. So you need arginine for your T cells to proliferate and differentiate. So when you get any kind of like immune stimulation, that will tend to drop your arginine as your immune system deals with that.
Nitric oxide is also used by the immune system too, right? Kind of as a defendant to kill invasive cells.
Yeah, and so there's like 3 enzymes that'll produce nitric oxide. The endothelial one in your blood vessels, the neuronal one in your nervous system, and then the inducible one, that's what the immune system uses to use nitric oxide to kill bacteria and other things. And so when that's another way your arginine can get depleted. But if your body's fighting endotoxin or bacteria or viruses, it's going to divert nitric oxide away from your blood vessels and into those other roles. But so as a result of that, at the time, I was like, well, I don't know if I haven't figured out how to bring my lysine down yet, but I could take more citrulline and arginine. Citrulline's a precursor to arginine in order to like bring that equation into more balance. And when I did, it's pretty rare that I doesn't seem like much that I do other than training really affects my heart rate variability. But when I started supplementing citrulline and arginine, I just saw this massive increase in my HRV where it nearly doubled.
Wow.
And that signifying that I was probably lacking something there before, and that this was letting things be in a better state than they were previously. So that's something I've kept up. Citrulline has some interesting research where it can stimulate mTOR in a different but similar way to leucine does. So it's very important for stimulating muscle mass. Some research that it can reduce delayed onset muscle soreness and just improve recovery and in general, and your rep performance better, maybe by improving muscle perfusion. Which reminded me another interesting thing about the phosphate. So Ray Peat talks about carbon dioxide is improving that oxygen dissociation curve.
Mm-hmm.
There's also something in your red blood cells called 2,3-diphosphoglycerate, or 2,3-DPG. And when you load phosphorus, it will increase the amount of 2,3-DPG in your red blood cells. And that's another factor that changes the oxygen dissociation curve and makes oxygen offload into your tissues more easily.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So phosphorus, citrulline, arginine, potassium, those are on my stack right now.
I'd imagine magnesium too, right? Or are you getting, no way you're getting 1,000 milligrams of magnesium from food.
I supplement magnesium, yeah.
That'd be a lot of chocolate.
Yeah. Too many calories.
Yeah. I don't want to keep you too long, but had one last question for you, if you don't mind. You're a pretty big, strong, muscular dude, so you need to put on some numbers. What is your mile high view for putting on muscle that people traditionally may not have heard? Or do you think the traditional advice is pretty on par? Apparently we need to supplement with some citrulline and arginine to boost that too, so that's interesting.
Yeah, I would add the combination. I don't know what proportion to attribute to what, but the combination of arginine, citrulline, potassium, and phosphate certainly over the last 6 months made me leaner and put on size more readily. And there is animal research on that, arginine and improving the leanness and muscle growth of livestock pigs. There's some case studies where bodybuilders in the past have been taking 40 grams of arginine. There's some rationale for that, arginine is typically considered a non-essential amino acid because our body can make it, but the flux for an average size human, how much we would produce if we didn't take in any, is somewhere in that 30 to 40 gram range for most people. The combination of arginine and citrulline seems to be better than either one of them alone. So citrulline will raise your blood arginine better than arginine itself, but there were some studies where they compared the full dose of citrulline and a full dose of arginine to a half dose of the combination, and the half dose of the combination resulted in the best elevation, the best effects they were looking at there, which was reducing cholesterol in your arteries.
Interesting.
Yeah. So those are ones I would investigate. Sure.
What about in the gym?
For training wise, or?
Yeah.
In what sense?
Do you think go high intensity, heavier weights, adequate volume? How would you train if you were trying to step on the stage, not necessarily literally step on stage, but pack on as much muscle as possible?
Right. So there's probably something like an inverted U relationship between the amount of volume you do and how much muscle you can gain. So like it's going to increase together to a certain point, and then once you exceed the volume that you're capable of recovering from, you'll gain less muscle than if you just did less volume. But you can't give any blanket recommendation there because it's dependent on like the individual and so many things in their lifestyle. And for me, again, I'm finding this every 5 days for where my body is right now really seems optimal, and it's less than a lot of other people are used to training.
You're only lifting once every 5 days?
I lift lower body once every 5 days and upper body once every 5 days. So those are typically back to back. So I'll do like lower day, upper day. They each have a 5-day break, and then I repeat however many workouts that ends up being. If I like know for some reason that I can't make that 5-day interval, I'll try and do like a little maintenance lift where I pick a few exercises and just do one set to failure, usually with a weight like I'm comfortable not warming up with. And that way I keep the maintenance stimulus, but I don't tire myself out enough that the next time I have a chance for a full lift, I can still go heavy and hard. And then on the days that I'm lifting, usually for like the lifts that I picked as key, like front squat and bench press now, I'll warm up to a heavy single, not a true 1 rep max, but like close to it. And then back off to maybe 75 to 80% of that, and do anywhere from 3 to 6 sets of like 3 to 5 at that weight. If I'm feeling extra spicy, like the last one will be an AMRAP. So I'll just go for it on the last one.
Only if you're feeling spicy.
Yeah. Like some days it's there, and other days it's not, and I just try to like maintain, like stimulate, and then recover till the next time I feel spicy again. But some combination of heavy, some combination of like probably training to failure and finding out what your limits are, and then paying attention to like how much you can recover to. I also know, like just another example there, when I was training for powerlifting, I was getting some programming from Reactive Training Systems, who's Mike Tashir, and trained some high-level powerlifters. But they would have me benching 4 times a week, squatting 3 times a week, and deadlifting twice. Definitely, like with that frequency, especially for bench press training upper 4 days a week, I've ran that twice and made the best bench progress ever in those blocks, but it was more variable day to day and have more low days. And just over time and with recovery, I'd see the numbers go up. There's nothing wrong with that approach. I just like being able to hit it harder more often. And it seems like the 5-day intervals where it's at for me right now.
Gotcha. Well, that was awesome. Thank you very much for taking the time. I think there's a lot of good information packed in there. Where can everyone find you?
I guess Instagram's the main place, at Nicholas Simpson _, and the business page at Vital Strength and Physiology.
Awesome. All right, well, Nicholas, thank you again for taking time. Until next time, guys, be good.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler.
If you made it this far, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you're on YouTube. And if you're not, make sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you're podcasting. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys for taking time. I hope you enjoyed this one. Till next time, guys, be good.